Chapter 4 Learning Transcendence. Transcendence is a big word that doesn't get much respect in our culture. Translated from the Latin root, it means to climb over. I like that root definition. It clearly implies the work required to progress from a narrow or ordinary state of mind to a bigger, more inclusive state. One doesn't simply float into an enlightenment or compassion or faith. When one suddenly experiences a transcendent moment, it's like coming to the top of a mountain. The complete vista may not be in view until the very last step, and thus it may seem that one movement was all it took to get there. In the ecstasy and wonderment of the big view, one may be tempted to forget the time spent setting up base camp, trudging patiently over miles of stony trails, and hanging on for dear life to sheer rock faces. One has to labor for liberation. But it's liberation that finally gives the meaning to the toil that it takes to get there. Faith is always headed in a transcendent direction. And faith is, among other things, the attempt to hold inside of ourselves the feeling of transcendence, a mysterious knowledge of the infinity, grandeur, and magnificence that are all around us every day, but are so often forgotten. In this aspect, faith is applied awe. This part of faith feels illogical because our minds cannot grasp infinity. The most we can hold of it is a passing and translucent sensation of sublimity. The greatest faith we can hold on to is the tiniest particle of an overwhelming truth. Yet that particle has a nourishing radioactivity. It ameliorates the ever-present sorrow of life on earth with the ever-glowing tranquility of a universal consciousness. Without a particle of transcendent faith, life is dry and dispirited, an aching slavery to the treadmill of survival. Our culture is embarrassed, ignorant, and fearful of transcendence, often to the point of calling it madness. And yet we see all around us the innate, desperate urge to transcend ourselves through negative means, especially through addictions to drugs, food, sex, gambling, fame, wealth, and so on. In love with our rational, scientific, and deadly dull view of what constitutes reality, we have devised an awkward strategy to deal with our instinctive transcendent urges. First, we ridicule and demonize transcendent experience, and then we build an economy, both lawful and illicit, that caters inappropriately to our frustrated yearnings for transcendence. And then we tell the kids, just say no, just say no. And we wonder why our culture seems to be going nuts. In indigenous so-called primitive cultures, still animated by instinctive spirituality, it is accepted that transcendent experience helps people understand their life purpose and purpose in the human community. This is what initiation rituals are all about. They help young people get a practical view of what their life on Earth is supposed to be about. That practical view is a kind of triangulation, whose 3 points might be identified as self, community, and the great beyond. You have to journey into the great beyond and know how to safely return there occasionally to keep a sane perspective on your everyday life. That's just how it is. Relying on a religion to tell you what the great beyond is all about won't cut it. We must have some first hand experience. Fortunately, access is easier than NASA. Our religious leaders or our greatest scientific minds might believe. The route is through inner space. The journey into inner space is not always pleasant. I was initiated to my purpose in life through a painful crisis, and I didn't care for that at the time. But the labor of it liberated me. And now, a few years down the road, I've been relearning what I knew in my childhood but forgot on the rocky road of adulthood. Transcendence is as near as nature and my own dreams, as readily accessible as looking at the nightly canopy of stars. Transcendence is an inborn capacity to go beyond myself, whenever I am willing to slow down enough to stop worrying about being myself. Have you ever gazed at a clear sky long enough to realize that you are not looking at a huge blue screen, but peering into the infinite? Have you ever watched a large old tree long enough to sense a bit of its incomprehensible might and balance as it holds up its lengthy limbs towards the warmth of vastly distant burning star? Have you ever stared at your hand until it seemed a total mystery? In these countless and other transcendental moments, easily accessible experiences, lie the practical heart of mysticism. Of all the things that our lonely culture is desperately seeking, perhaps it longs to regain a mystical heartbeat most of all. The good news is that we live in the midst of mystery at every moment. We are mystery. To awaken to transcendence is to admit a simple truth. We do not know what is going on in ourselves, in our own minds, in the core of a tree, in the great distance between planets, stars, and galaxies. The paradox is that by giving up trying to analyze and demystify reality all the time, we can find the key to a practical faith, a deep self-realization, and an illimitable joy. Illimitable? Unlimitable? Illimitable? Yeah. Okay. To admit that we are surrounded by mystery is to recognize ourselves. To learn transcendence is to unlearn the miserable notion that we are alone. Faith and longing. Inside faith is longing. That is the secret of its energy. This longing is the desire to return to God, to creation itself, and to the forgotten state of union we knew before we knew ourselves as individuals. The way back to this union is through longing. To belong is to be longing. Without longing, faith is a forced march through the constant doubting of the lonely and imperiled ego. It is a self-preservation without sustenance. Longing is ecstatic and periodically dangerous. Many religions avoid teaching or practicing of longing and become tepid as a result. Some religions have not forgotten longing, but have tried to civilize it, scheduling it, usually in the form of prayer, into the morning service along with the hymns and the passing of the silver plate. But longing doesn't respond well to scheduling. Religious longing draws sensible people into cults and diverts their natural capacity for faith into the service of wayward teachers and outright maniacs. Our culture is unfamiliar with ecstatic longing and embarrassed by its expressions, so we repress it. Thus, when spiritual longing erupts in our lives, we can easily be overwhelmed by it, feeling a great liberation and throwing off all logic and skepticism. But a practical faith holds longing and rationality in balance. Like a minister who joins two contrary lovers in a lifetime vow to honor and obey each other. Many people may think it is impossible for longing and logic to simultaneously obey each other. Yet it is within that paradoxical fire of opposites that a transcendent and creative clarity is shaped. Between the anvil of longing and the hammer of skepticism, we can shape ideas and solutions of profound originality, strength, and durability. Faith and surrender. Faith requires surrender. In the course of a day, we may claim so many false and ludicrous victories. We got a parking space, we got a free lunch, we got even with somebody. That a daily authentic surrender to a bigger reality is hardly excessive. I try to surrender at the beginning of the day before I've made any decisions or developed too many anticipations about what should happen in the coming 24 hours. I pray simply that I will accept whatever is coming my way in a spirit of gratitude, understanding that what I will believe has happened, good or bad, is only the surface of reality. What seems to be going on is only what I am allowing myself to perceive at any given moment. In other words, reality is always transcendent, whereas I just occasionally get a glimpse of the transcendent. The same is true of God. If we're going to believe in God, I think that we have to believe in a God that we don't know very well. Because the God we think we know, based on religions or cultural ideas most familiar to us, is merely our own partial myth of God. Thus, to believe only in that God is to pray and surrender only to our own ideas. To have faith in a transcendent God is to take a chance on an ultimate and incomprehensible creativity, trusting that we can all share equally and fruitfully in that creativity if we are open, patient, and willing to release our guilt in the name of peace. Religious tolerance is the willingness to surrender our various partial ideas of God and to the possibility of a uniting, transcendent God, a God who resolves all paradoxes and dissolves every apparent conflict. If we can surrender our personal expectations for each day to the will of such a God, we may someday be able to surrender our religious conflicts as well. When trouble is transcendent. An emotional or moral crisis often induces the feeling of being pushed up against a wall, forced beyond our capacities, or unfairly intimidated by fate. Perhaps it's tiresome to say that every such challenge represents a kind of opportunity, but in this case, the cliche derives from an uncomfortable truth. This is not to suggest that we should fake a cheery enthusiasm about the times when our life seems to be falling apart. But I would like to suggest that it's important to keep an eye out for the falseness of too much pessimism as well. Pessimism is far more popular in our culture than enthusiasm, which originally meant inspired by a god. And we are seldom skeptical of the authenticity of pessimism, and even more rarely do we question its usefulness. In many dreams, I have had the peculiar experience of traveling through walls in order to leave a room. In dreams, this seems like a more direct way of exiting than using the door. God only knows why. This passing through a wall, however, always precipitates a crisis. The passage is difficult and fearful, and I always realize about halfway through that I've undertaken something extraordinary that I don't rationally know how to do. I feel a peculiar, very distinct interchanging of my molecules with the molecules of the wall. The dream body doesn't punch a hole in the wall and then go through. It mixes with the wall. And while I am in the middle of the transit, I can feel that I am both the wall and myself, although I know that I am what is moving through the wall and that the wall is what will stay. When the passage is complete, I invariably find myself floating in the sky, able to fly freely. When trouble confronts us, we are indeed being pushed up against a wall. But if we turn to face it with an open, exploratory attitude, we may discover that it is not as impenetrable as it first appears. Finding opportunity in crisis means mixing with the crisis, letting our shape match its shape temporarily, letting our particles exchange places with its particles as we push our way through fear and ultimately through the crisis itself. It is a mystical, inexplicable process that is always new in each occurrence of crisis. This means it is an initiation demanding new learning and offering yet another chance to earn our wings. Dreams and transcendence. Dreams are the perfect teachers of transcendence. Regularly available, if a bit challenging to access, intimately personal and creative, yet impossible to claim entirely as products of one's own ego, and impenetrable to complete analysis, yet capable of changing one's life direction and with occasional bursts of ferocious, well-aimed symbolism and feeling. Our culture's generally unfamiliarity with the language of dreams is one indicator of our disconnection with instinctive spirituality. It's no accident that the society that has most devalued dreams has created a colossal motion picture and television industry. The need to experience alternate realities will not be denied. The feverish development of virtual reality technology is an attempt to carry the artificial creation of dreams one step further, but it isn't really necessary. That's funny because Meta collapsed just recently. the metaverse. Each of us already has free access to a transcendent realm of alternate realities. Yes, each of us already has free access to a transcendent realm of alternate realities. A friend of mine tells the story of an anthropologist who took a television to an indigenous tribe. Within just a couple of hours, they became disinterested with the tube and returned thereafter to the entertainments of their own storyteller. When the scientist pointed out to one of the villagers that the TV knew many more stories to tell, he replied, "Yes, but our storyteller knows me." This is precisely the difference between our dreams and movies. Our dreams know us, often better than we consciously know ourselves. A film is deeply affecting when it seems to know us, connecting both intellectually and emotionally in a way that reveals us to ourselves and decreases our sense of isolation. But most film and broadcast media cater chiefly to our desire to be entertained. a healthy movie in the right proportion. However, in a culture where many people live without a sense of purpose beyond mere survival, the motive to be entertained grows out of all proportion, becoming a constant and sometimes desperate addiction to being distracted from the aching of the soul's starvation. Dreams can be as entertaining or uplifting or as thrilling or as scary as any movie, yet they are always teaching us about us. Often their messages are strictly personal. Occasionally, they're profoundly instructive about the fundamental nature of consciousness and reality. The most sophisticated understanding of dreams is that they are not all that much different from what we call reality. That is the beginning of a transcendent vision. Depression, shadow, and transcendence. I grew up on intimate terms with depression, as it haunted my mother's life, and I experienced it both emotional and physiological forms throughout my first 30 years. Though depression is widely regarded as a psychological or biochemical disorder, I have come to understand it is also a form of spiritual crisis. To me, its growing prevalence in our society is a sign of our spiritual alienation. For what I have to say about it, I can claim no clinical confirmation or even much agreement from experts in the field. I can say that I have met and mastered depression in my own life, and through that process, I have gained some insight into the affliction. Depression is, according to its degree, the relative absence of faith. Severe depression is a negative mystical state in which the sufferer is in danger because of the presence of God, as a vital and deeply felt creative force, not a religious belief, has been virtually driven from awareness. This is why nothing seems possible. The severely depressed person is limited strictly to the resources of his or her own ego, which, without divine energy to draw on, has no resources. Thus, the depressed person is face to face with the horror of his or her own nothingness. This is the realm of absolute shadow. The irony of depression is that it teaches one truth. The ego, that self-made idea of ourselves, really is nothing. The more we depend on it alone, the less life force and creative possibility will be available to us. The experience of depression is humiliating, yet the road into depression is paved with hubris. Because in one way or another, there has been an increasing exclusion of faith from daily life and the acceptance of its place in either habitual cynicism or its twin, habitual victimization. Cynicism masks its arrogance by pretending to be factual and rational. Victimization masks its arrogance by refusing to move beyond the suffering of attack or catastrophe, often proclaiming a false right to vengeance in the process. To collaborate with either of these states is to invite depression. To resist them is to elicit faith, to elect faith. The best thing to do in the midst of depression is to recognize its negative mysticism and respectfully confront the lies it tells. One or more of the following strategies may prove helpful in this regard. Turn to nature. Depression tends to isolate the individual within his or her own private realm of experience and then makes that realm seem inescapable. Spending time in nature and paying attention to nature can return a proper perspective to one's inner world. Activate the body, preferably in a playful way. Depression tends to deny the body's own nature, especially the childlike aspects of that nature. Playing the silliest physical games can help redirect depressive energies. In fact, a sure sign that depression holds sway over one's consciousness is an angry refusal to play. Confront guilt and other negative convictions. The biggest lie that depression tells is that it's impossible to change one's mind. Whenever I feel the sickly lure of depression, I have learned to think, I must be wrong about something that I don't have to be wrong about. Usually I discover that I have decided to feel guilty or deeply pessimistic about something that I do not understand sufficiently to judge. Ask God for help. The big stumbling block for atheists and cynics in depression is that they fear God as a punishing parent, or they resent someone else's overbearing idea of God. But God is someone who wants only to be of use to anyone in suffering. Um, a mystical partner who responds to a plea as simple and as serious as, I need help from beyond myself. This practical and generous God responds by lifting one's spirits and doesn't even bill for services rendered. Anyone who tells you that God does charge for assistance is trying to divert funds for some unwholesome use. If we can entertain the possibility that there is a helpful and infinitely resourceful God to call on in every circumstance, then we can maintain enough humility to make depression the road never chosen. After all, there are better states in which to realize the nothingness of the ego. Bliss, for instance. Depression fixates on the deadly notion, I am nothing. Bliss celebrates the liberating truth, I am nothing without God. In that seemingly simple difference lies the choice between a deadening despair and a livable joy. Renunciation. In a culture that confuses freedom with the unlimited right to self-indulgence, we have a hard time understanding the spiritual value of renunciation. We tend to see renunciation as nothing more than self-denial. Then we accord self-denial a kind of phony nobility. And then feel free to admit that we are just up, not not up to being all that noble. If we are we're If we are in the thrall of these assumptions, then we are likely to live a life devoted mostly to the easily gained short-term gratifications and end up wondering why we never experienced a deeper satisfaction. Properly seen, renunciation is not a self-denial at all, but rather an invaluable part of self-transcendence. It's the climbing over our own habits and limitations into a fresh and constant evolving way of being. Of course, renunciation is not easy, whether one is renouncing smoking in order to find a fuller breath or renouncing a Mercedes in order to share the wealth. In fact, it is just too damn difficult to choose against what is delicious, irresistible, and so easily grabbed or bought, unless you understand that renunciation profits you more in the long term. To be transformative, renunciation has to be a practical choice, not a religious imperative. I have never been a great renunciator, but I have practiced enough to learn that a true renunciation delivers a moment of pain. There is a distinct sensation of loss and confusion as the self, who is fond of repeating pleasant, or at least familiar, routines, feels the shock of a new direction chosen by the greater self. This moment of pain should not be attended or should be attended closely and with care, for it can be read as a measure of one's own readiness for change. A pain that screams in terror may signal that the renunciation being attempted is too great for the present time. A pain that slyly whimpers may be a signal that the intended renunciation is not quite sincere, or that perhaps is not as adventurous as it could be. We may either pity or admire those who chose a renunciate life in a cloistered environment, but appearances can deceive. Over the long term, such a dramatic renunciation may be easier in a closed culture that demands or reinforces it. It is in the midst of the tempting modern world, freewheeling, free spending, and always advertising self indulgences, that voluntary renunciation may hold the greatest transcendent potential. In the thick of the merry material world, renunciation can be transforming, even if practiced in fits and starts. In other words, renunciation need not be a romantic lunge at purity when a courageous courtship of transcendence will suffice. Direct experience. Most people adopt a religion either because it was handed down to them or because an irreligious way of life proved too dangerous or disheartening to continue. The purpose of most religions is to provide people with a fixed explanation of the mysteries of existence and a set of moral guidelines by which to live a productive life. As long as religious beliefs are not used as weapons, a conventional religious life can be one of reasonable peacefulness, productivity, and virtue. It is not meant so much to challenge or change one's nature as to control and make the most of it. A spiritual path, however, is a transformative journey into the transcendent. It begins with the realization that things are not as they seem, and that the religious rules about reality are useful only insofar as one accepts the common agreement about what reality is. When you begin to see through consensus reality into transcendent realms, it becomes necessary to start exploring the mysteries of existence on your own. Religious ideas become theories to be tested firsthand rather than accepted without question. And the veteran spiritual seeker tests as many kinds of ideas as possible along the way of discovering his or her own unique perspectives on divinity, creation, and human purpose. In this process, a spiritual path changes one's nature from the inside out. It brings about a real reformation of the individual. As that process deepens, the individual becomes capable of living by his or her own instinctive moral code, a code that surpasses social and religious rules for governing behavior and serving the human community. We live in a time when more people than ever are becoming authentic spiritual seekers, true explorers on the path. Whether they seek truth inside or outside of churches, temples, and mosques, more and more people are finding it necessary to see the ordinary circumstances of their lives and glimpse a transcendent reality. Along the way, they develop a practical faith in God, or an all creative wisdom. This God, or wisdom, is directly experienced in these people's spiritual practices. In the same way that conventional religion has failed many people, conventional politics are failing to keep pace with the demands of a rapidly changing world. The old oppositions of left versus right, rich versus poor, and rights versus responsibility is no longer served. And it is increasingly clear that the political leaders and activists must become the ideas they promote. In other words, the politics of the future will belong to transformed individuals who have made change real within themselves before attempting to change the world. In general, the signs of their authenticity will be humility, flexibility, and empathy. To make change real within ourselves is to embody transcendence, to know God as a transformative force constantly at work within ourselves, rather than to merely believe in God as an external judge or savior. Thus, the politics of the future will be spiritually charged, but not religiously prescribed. The politics of the future will be a practical faith in action instead of a cultural agenda being pursued merely in the name of faith. The arrival of reverence. Reverence is the recognition of the sublime within the ordinary, a recognition that automatically inspires thanksgiving. Reverence cannot be taught or enforced. Reverence arrives on its own, as the unbidden reward of practicing faith. Saying grace, for instance, is merely an act without if you're not feeling grace. We feel grace grow within us as our guilt is released, our trust is strengthened, and our patience is developed. Then, at unpredictable moments, we find ourselves able to touch the transcendental part of our own nature. In recognition of that limitlessness, we begin to understand divinity as something real and life-giving, something at the root of our being, something surrounding our being completely, and something we cannot help but revere. Thus, reverence is simultaneously a gift we realize and an offering we make. Reverence electrifies our consciousness with gratitude for the transcendence that we have learned so far. Oh my God. Oh, okay. A little bit to go still. Continuing on. The last bit. The rewards. The best bit, maybe. The rewards of a practical faith. There is a part of any spiritual path that is irreducibly mystical. That is, you live the path simply because it irresistibly draws and directs you, and its benefits are felt so deeply that they may be difficult to explain in words. It is important to remember that living in faith can never be wholly defended in conventional terms of profit and loss or potential yield. But the seeker who cannot articulate any rewards of their choice to live by faith runs the risk of sinking into lonely delusions, being conned by phony teachers, or resorting to fanaticism in order to shore up beliefs that have failed the test of their usefulness. A mystical belief that produces no demonstrable positive change in one's life is merely spiritual romanticism. By demonstrable, I mean something that other people notice, or at least an interior change in one's feelings, attitudes, and worldview so remarkable that it results in a sense of wonder, joy, and reverence. Of course, even spiritual romanticism has its charms, and it sells pretty well. Too much Contemporary spiritual writing is couched in airy, romantic language that leaves readers with something like a mental sugar high, providing a short term but ultimately inapplicable kind of inspiration. Knowing how easy it is to slip into spiritual romanticism, I have thought a great deal about the specific improvements that have come about in my life as a result of pursuing a practical faith. In closing, I'd like to discuss these rewards in terms as clear and concrete as possible. By doing this, I hope to provide the readers with with definitive information on the value of surrendering cynicism, chronic anger, and other self-destructive and fruitless perspectives on life. Perspectives that lately are all the rage, so to speak. I began this book by saying that a practical faith can supply the experience of stability, security, and fulfillment. Qualities that are at the core of what people long for in life. Here is how I understand these qualities. Stability. Maintaining a practical faith at the center of my consciousness means that my worries and self-doubts cannot live there. Instead, they must inhabit the edges of my self-awareness, where they belong. Before the health and spiritual crisis that induced me to regain my instinctive childhood faith, my doubts and my worries frequently invaded or even held sway over my center all throughout my young adulthood years. These anxieties drew off my vital energy and used that energy to distract me and misdirect me. As a result, my inner life was chaotic and disheartening. This condition dominated my outer life of work and relationships as well. Experiencing a stable core of faith not only drives my problems to the edges of my awareness, but changes my perspective on them as well. Living a practical faith reminds me that I am always on a path of healing the pain, incompleteness, and isolation of being human. Thus, I can regard any problems or challenges that arises in terms of healing. The questions that I used to ask myself when under pressure: how could I be so stupid? Why am I being attacked for no reason? Why is life so unfair? What's the use of trying to be or do good? Are replaced with one inquiry: how will the problem at hand serve the healing of myself and humanity? In this way, I experience my problems and resultant worries as my leading edge of learning. Instead of serving as proof that there is something wrong with me or with the world, my unresolved concerns serve as directional pointers towards what I have yet to learn. From day to day, this central core of faith provides me with the mental and emotional stability that, that compares remarkably well to the instability of my earlier life. Many people grow more stable as they age, but I am not talking about the maturing process of a self-serving ego, which often brings a stability rife with bitterness, suspicion, and closed-mindedness. By contrast, I arrived at a stable faith through learning to surrender ego, a process that apparently never finished in this world, but that is apparent that is apparently never finished in this world, but can never nonetheless be pursued with increasing skill and success. Moving our worries and doubts to the edge of our awareness is in fact the same process as the removing the fearful, heavily defended ego from the center of our awareness. This allows faith, which, like a seed, is not of our making but can be planted and nurtured with deliberate care, to root and grow into a great and stable tree at the center of our being. Security. Stability and security are critically linked because many of the anxieties of insecurity, does anyone love me? Will I have enough money? Am I in danger? Are actually symptoms of an inward instability projected onto outer concerns. When very little stability is felt within, the outer world seems terrifying or deliberately vengeful. When self-reliance and trustworthiness are felt within, the outer world is seen more accurately. Still, a practical faith does not guarantee loving relationships, a good job or income, or safety from all dangers. In fact, there are no guarantees of these things because the world is somehow unpredictable or somewhat unpredictable, dangerous, and unsecured. Were the world constantly safe, nurturing, and reliable, there would be no need for faith at all. So faith is best seen as the most practical strategy for maximizing one's own potential to deal with a world in which we cannot know what will happen next. Nonetheless, my practical faith has delivered many of the elements of security that I used to seek without success. I have now a happy marriage secured by our mutual dedication to healing and growth. I worry comparatively little about my economic condition, despite the fact that my bottom line isn't that much better than it's ever been. And while I exercise remarkable caution on the city streets and country trails, I am not pursued by fears of crime, accidents, or persecution. I accept that this is a world in which all kinds of terrible things could happen to me or my loved ones, regardless of my faith. But at least I save myself daily from the punishing anxiety of paranoia. In this way, a practical faith supplies far more security than I have ever achieved through faithless schemes of and self-defensiveness. How does this work? Faith supplies a reasonable degree of security because deep within faith there is a mystical knowledge of another world and another kind of existence that is perfectly secure, constant, and unchanging. In religious traditions, this faintly recalled other world is called paradise or heaven, and is variously believed to precede or follow our existence, or to be underneath or far above this world, to be everyone's ultimate destination, or just a reward reserved solely for the righteous. I believe that paradise is, like God, an idea. Not an idea that we made up, but an idea that came before us and that we can fortunately discover, enter into, and explore without end. A practical faith will lead us towards surpassing reality, towards a surpassing reality, a secure reality not of our making. Ultimately, we will gladly surrender all of our lesser ideas about what is real to this surpassing reality. The proof of our progress along the spiritual route is a growing sense of inner security despite all of the world's dangers and uncertainties. Fulfillment. If stability and security weren't enough to satisfy the human spirit, if they were enough to satisfy the human spirit, we'd all be house pets. Clearly, we are driven by a need to express ourselves, or to be of use, or to achieve something, whether large or small, that symbolizes our unique characters. In a world of so much struggle and confusion, the drive for fulfillment can easily get waylaid by the silly, short-sighted, or destructive ambitions that we have sometimes. Or it can be confused with the desire for security. The desire for personal wealth far beyond one's needs is just such a confusion between the legitimate desires for security and fulfillment. I knew from childhood that I would be fulfilled through writing, but in my early adulthood I lost my instinctive sense of direction and no longer knew what to write about. So I focused for some years on the pursuit of economic security, with unimpressive results. Paradoxically, it was during this time of exceptional crisis, when I had lost virtually all of my stability and security, that my drive for fulfillment unexpectedly reasserted itself, and I realized that I would begin writing again. My new subject matter was healing, particularly healing at the mind and the spirit levels, the very kind of healing that was restoring my natural, long-lost faith to me. Perhaps it is the bias of my experience that convinces me that all genuine fulfillment serves healing in some way. The very drive for fulfillment suggests that we are somehow unfulfilled, which to me means that we commonly experience a deficit of divine inspiration. To be healed, to become whole, is to recover that inspiration. If we look to conventional worldly goals like fame, riches, and influence, we are unlikely to find lasting fulfillment, and we may in fact encounter great defeats and disillusionment along the way. Like faith, divine inspiration is something that comes from beyond us, but that we can invite into our experience and thereafter follow its lead towards fulfillment. At the lowest point of my health and spiritual crisis, I lay in a darkened room and said to myself earnestly, I give up my former life and accept the way of the heart. I had borrowed the words from my spiritual reading, and I didn't know exactly what I was talking about. But I did have a compelling, twofold sense of surrender and invitation. I also had no idea what would follow. I didn't even know if that moment would prove to be significant or if I would soon forget about it. In fact, what followed in the ensuing weeks and months were the first appreciable signs of improvement in my health and unexpected inspirations and opportunities that would soon coalesce into my new writing career. By the way, I've experienced many other moments of surrender and invitation since, and some have proven more significant than others. As with all forms of spiritual petitioning, practice increases productivity. Nowadays, inspiration continues to arrive in the form of unanticipated opportunities and unplanned undertakings. And I am amazed at my productivity in comparison to the years when I really wanted to be a writer but had no idea of whom or how my writing might serve. While there are still more things to try and some worldly goals I would like to achieve, I do not need to attain these objectives to find a far off fulfillment. My fundamental fulfillment is always close at hand, in the work itself. Compared to the way I used to struggle for a sense of purpose and recognition, this feeling of inherent fulfillment in my work is quite literally a miracle of transformation. For anyone who might worry that such fulfillment would result in complacency and creative stagnation, let me say that my experience is just the opposite. Authentic fulfillment is simultaneously complete in the moment and always pulling one towards greater possibilities of service in the future. This feeling of expanding completeness is something I never experienced in my earlier faith deficient life, and I consider it to be a divine quality that surpasses the ego's sense of possibility. If anyone asks me how to start a new career or become a writer or an artist or a rocket scientist, now I would say, find a way to surrender your ambitions and invite divine inspiration to help you learn to serve. Anyone who tried to follow this advice would necessarily have to develop some faith that there is such a mysterious and powerful thing as divine inspiration. In this way, faith makes fulfillment possible. And a growing sense of authentic fulfillment certifies the practicality of faith. When we feel stable, secure, and fulfilled, our deepest longings are answered, and we arrive at a sense of completion. The feeling that we no longer need to search outside ourselves for something that has always been missing. When we know that there is nothing missing within ourselves, we are truly at home in a world that may have felt like a strange and hostile territory before. It is a practical faith that delivers us to this sense of being at home. And it is a practical faith that can help us carry that home within us, no matter what happens, and regardless of wherever we are led to serve during our stay on earth. Without knowing it when I began, one of the reasons I have written this book is to celebrate the discovery of my own home within, the dynamic completion that I now feel where once there was a static and confused incompleteness. I hope that I have been practical enough in my words and faithful enough to my inspiration to help others find a faster route to their own homecoming. It is not merely possible to find a more faithful, loving, and sagacious way to live than we have known so far. It is our destiny, and it patiently awaits completion. Thank you for listening.